All right, hello everyone, and welcome. We're delighted to have you with us today at the Alliance Magazine and Luminate webinar called Rights and Justice in the Digital Age. How can philanthropy ensure technology works for people and planet? I'm just going to give one little minute here for us to get set up with the Slido and make sure everyone can join. And then I'm going to run through some housekeeping. Great. So you should be seeing Slido on your screen. So let me start with the housekeeping. So just so everybody is aware, before we get started, the session is being recorded, and the recording may be shared with participants and used for future reference or promotional purposes. I think the plan is to put it on Alliance Magazine's YouTube page. If you'd like to ask some questions, we will hopefully have some time for questions at the end. Please use the Slido app, which I mentioned is kind of integrated into this webinar software. So you should see that on the right-hand side of your screen down near the chat box. And feel free to use that chat function to say hello and to reach out to the Alliance team if you're having any technical issues, because they are here to help. So this webinar is jointly organised by Alliance Magazine and Luminate. You may be more familiar with Alliance than Luminate, so let me just introduce them quickly. It's part of the Omidyar network, and it's a global foundation working to ensure that everyone, especially those who are underrepresented, has the information, rights and power to influence the decisions that affect their lives. My name is Liz Carolan. I'm going to be taking us through the next 50 minutes, and I'm a consultant supporting Luminate with this webinar. And I'm also a writer and activist working on tech and democracy here from a unusually sunny Dublin this afternoon where I am. And so Alliance Magazine, you will know, is the critical friend of philanthropy worldwide, and they are hosting us today, which is fantastic. And just to let you know, as a thank you for joining us, Alliance are offering a 20% discount on subscriptions with the code EVENT25 at checkout. I think you'll probably get that in an email to follow up. But what are we here to talk about? So over the next 50 minutes or so, you'll hear from both grant makers and from grantees, brilliant people doing amazing work about the opportunities and challenges around both emergent and existing technology. And for those of us who care about rights and justice and about people and planet. You may have noticed there's a lot going on at the moment. Just today, there's pre-events happening in Geneva for UN's AI for Good Summit. This is happening at a time when we're seeing kind of protests and activism emerge around tech company involvement in everything from climate disinformation through to military surveillance, through to CSAM and other forms of harassment and abuse. It's also happening in the context of pressure for some of the long fights that we've had around regulatory protections in Europe to be put on pause. And the US is attempting to sort of block some of that regulation from happening. So there's lots to talk about. Luckily, we have the most brilliant panel, a real dream team of people working across the kind of grantee and funder spectrum to guide us through this. We have Melanie Hui, who is the CEO of Luminate, we just mentioned. They're one of our co-hosts. We have Pat de Brun, who's the head of big tech accountability at Amnesty International. We have Urvashi Neha, who is the founder and executive director of Digital Futures Lab in India. And we have Patricia Melendez, who is the program officer at the Oak Foundation. So we will be coming to each of those in turn, and then, as I said, kind of opening up for questions at the end. But if, as we're going through, anything comes to mind, any questions or comments, do use the Slido app and pop them in, and we'll feed that into the conversation most definitely. Melanie, before I come to you, I just want to give us just a little bit of context. You know, I always think back to the kind of the early days of the internet were so full of optimism. We had all these ideas of these 20-somethings in dorm rooms and garages, creating very new cool tools that we thought would, and that did do quite a bit around changing the way that we engage with the world, around changing activism. You know, the apogee of that probably being the kind of the Arab Spring moment. But that optimism didn't last, and you know, it feels like it really started to creep away in the 2010s when tech seems to be delivering more hate, misinformation, eroding our privacy, addictive algorithms, right up to today, where we're seeing these companies that started out so small, um, now being some of the kind of wealthiest corporations in the world with these very strong links to power. And Melanie, I might come to you first if I can. Where are we now when it comes to technology and society? How do you see the big picture?
Liz, it was interesting your slides, remembering that early days of the internet that essentially felt like one gigantic experiment across borders, but inherently a hopeful one. Luminate's own beginnings really were rooted in that hope. 10 years ago, we were heavily supporting impactful civic tech initiatives. You know, it was a time where we were really inspired by technology, equaling optimism and how it would help liberate information. We saw how power could shift as a result. And I think as many people were finding their strength and opportunity in being able to connect online, we saw that it could really support social movements like the Arab Spring activists that you were mentioning earlier, and more recently the Southeast Asia's Milk Tea Alliance. Today, though, we have really seen the cost of being so digitized and so connected, and it too often feels like we're making some pretty uncomfortable trade-offs. We've seen how social media is affecting us and our attention, our privacy, our families, preying on already probably vulnerable individuals and affecting marginalized groups and drowning them in online hate. It's clear that mis and disinformation affects things like trust in climate science, trust in solutions, even medical expertise. So democracies, communities, countries around the world are being affected in different ways. I think reflecting on our pathway as an organization with a DNA that was fundamentally tech optimistic, we saw how power could be shifted, and now we're also seeing how power can be captured, really. It's the corporate capture that's really at the root of the trade-off that we're seeing happening in this increasingly digital world. I think we can point to the tech itself, but really the problem that we're really concerned with is power, because the early tech disruptors have grown so much and become monopolies. I think we can recall the four tech CEOs sitting in front with President Trump at his inauguration. Whether or not they wanted to be there, the symbolism was potent. Four men, pretty much all grown up professionally in that same valley of the west coast of the United States, kind of a nearly full portrait of tech power with global consequences. You know, they're all five companies, are the biggest tech companies in the world, the biggest companies in the world, and they've dominated the top of global economy for a decade now. So meanwhile, as we're seeing kind of this powerful capture become clearer, I think we're rightfully all becoming more skeptical about this outsized power, and how it impacts our lives. This year's Digital Trust Index shows that global trust in social media of social media companies is at a record low of 4%. And so I guess where we are today is that while we hold that we want a world where people have the tech tools to enable people to thrive, and this new wave of generative AI and its uses are becoming clearer, we are seeing that the opportunities are massive. I'm sure in conversation you've been having with other people in the social sector, we're talking about how AI can make impact in different ways to different sectors, making their people's work more impactful, being able to reach more people. And I have been inspired by all the ways in education and health and science, to think of scale, to think of better solutions through technology, through AI. And also not taking the past gains for granted, because civic action has been raised to a higher level of possibility. Um, in fact, even conversations like the one we're having today would be much, much harder by order of magnitude before these tools. So I'm holding all of this hope and possibility with also clearly the fact that the power and the risk and the opportunity are coming together in this moment, and very rapidly how technology is evolving. It means we're kind of at a crossroads today. Um, because of the corporate capture that I talked about, we are seeing that these companies are making decisions about how technology shows up in all our lives and in our decisions. And we're seeing many of the business models put profits before people. And policymakers and our governments are driven by a relentless logic of big tech profits.
Yeah.
So in the conversation today, we really want to make sure people understand what's being pushed so that we can have a say. We can have a more collective way of kind of reclaiming our autonomy, our agency, and deciding kind of what this digital world that we are living in increasingly is looking like. Because we've seen, right, power is fluid, and we know politics follows that, and politics is thus fluid. And despite what the tech companies might suggest, technology is fluid too. It can be made to do what its creators want it to do. And so we need to start have a say in this debate and how it's being used in a much more empowered way. And so it's still in a way a winnable negotiation. Despite the scale of this and the power of the companies, it obviously won't be won easily or won alone, but it is a kind of collective action issue. And like many others that were in the fight in the world today, it's something that we can still work on, and philanthropy has a role to play. I think it requires sustained support because it's such a nascent issue. It requires some risk tolerant investment because, after all, we're talking about challenging power structures here. And it needs a global outlook that's beyond Silicon Valley, not least because some of these mental models that brought us here today will have a hard time imagining a way through this. And also that the impacts that I'm sure our panelists will be talking about are going to be greatest to the people most on the margins of that power. And so this is why Luminate's kind of thinking about this issue and offering this discussion to the funder community today.
Fantastic. Thank you, Melanie. And I think you've really given us a great context there of just this dichotomy between all of these opportunities that we want to pursue, but then some of those just realities of that structural kind of power. And Melanie, I'm going to come back to you towards the end to talk about a little bit more about some of those opportunities and how people can get involved. But I might come on to Pat and Urvashi next, because you are both working on the front line of this work at the moment. So we have Urvashi Aneja, as I said, who is the founder and executive director of Digital Futures Lab, and Pat de Brun, head of Big Tech Accountability at Amnesty International. And I mean, I might just start with a slightly personal question of, you know, to both of you. How did you come to work on this topic? What was your path in to working on tech and society, tech accountability questions? Pat, I might come to you first.
Sure, thanks a lot, Liz. I mean, I came to this work really as my background is as a lawyer, a human rights lawyer and researcher, a generalist, but I was really drawn into tech accountability work some years ago when I was covering Vietnam for Amnesty as a researcher. And at that time, I think it was around 2019, 2020, we started receiving a ton of requests and complaints from local human rights defenders and activists in Vietnam who were being censored and having their voices silenced on social media. And Vietnam's a really interesting case study, actually, because it really aligns, I think, in parallel with the trajectory that I think you and Melanie both cited in your introductory remarks. It was such a beacon of hope in that country where there was very limited opportunities for speaking one's mind, where the traditional media was heavily censored, and the human rights community really put massive faith in social media, and Facebook and YouTube were really seen as these great opportunities for democratization, for the advancement of human rights. And then we started getting these complaints, and so we investigated what was going on. And ultimately what we found there was that big tech, and namely Google and Meta, were beginning to systematically censor people who were speaking up for human rights, who were calling out government abuses. And although at that time they were really professing to be those kind of protectors and defenders of human rights and freedom of speech and the connectors of people, it was very clear when we looked into it that once they were put under some pressure by the authoritarian government there, they very quickly made the decision that for their own profit interests, they would happily silence these human rights activists and defenders. And that really alarmed me. It also piqued my interest in this area because at the time, I think there was this sense of optimism about the transformational potential of these platforms and companies. But it was very apparent to me that there, in that context, at least, that when push came to shove, they would prioritize profit over public good and human rights every time. And I think it was a bit of a warning signal, and it was happening there. It was happening in other global majority contexts as well. And I think we can see that now, you know, unfolding, I think, across the world, that you know, the priorities of these companies
Yeah.
will always be around their own self-interest and profit. So that's what really pulled me into the space, tech accountability. And around the same time, you know, the Cambridge Analytica scandal was
Yeah.
unfolding. There was the Brexit result. There was Trump's first election. It was clear that big tech and social media was increasingly central to the big human rights and political kind of struggles that we were facing, and that it needed more attention. So
Yeah.
yeah, I was kind of hooked into it, and I'm kind of remain convinced to this day that it is central to all of these human rights challenges that we're facing.
Great. And Urvashi, I'd love to hear your story as well, and maybe if you can use it to talk us through a bit about as well then how you understand the problem of tech accountability, the problem of the information crisis.
Thanks, Liz, and great to be here and join such a great group of speakers. I think similar to Pat, you know, that's how my story is quite similar to Pat. I think I've always been kind of interested and concerned about how one kind of reconciles this tension between something might be good for specific individuals, but structurally it may not be so good for society. And before I kind of came into working in the digital space, I used to work in the humanitarian sector. And there I used to see this a lot, right? We used to have kind of humanitarian aid programs that were really providing essential food, shelter, water, sanitation for people who desperately needed it. But at the same time, it was also reinforcing a very colonial logic and reinforcing kind of power asymmetries. And how one reconciles that tension is something that has always been at the kind of forefront of my work. And then I saw it in the context of big tech, you know, where I live in India. And like I live in where I live in India, I can see big tech companies actually filling very crucial gaps in state capacity. They're providing critical marketing infrastructure, critical civic infrastructure, avenues for marginalized folks to participate in markets, enable civil society actors to actually connect with each other, and even enable the state to actually reach citizens that it couldn't reach before. But at the same time, big tech is also contributing to a huge amount of harm, much of which you mentioned already. And much of this is exasperated in countries like India and other parts of the global majority world, precisely because of that lack of state capacity and precisely because there isn't an alternative kind of public infrastructure that can balance the power of big tech companies. And, you know, so whether it's the spread of misinformation or the underinvestments in platforms to make them safe for marginalized communities, or the kind of capitulation to political power that we've seen in many countries in the global south. So I think this tension between kind of big tech as providers of essential infrastructure, but at the same time, big tech as harms being exasperated in the global south with reduced kind of accountability is really what kind of, you know, has been a thread running through my work. And now I think that problem has reached new magnitudes in the context of AI. And, you know, just to kind of move on to the second part of what you asked, Liz, you know, I worry that some of the harms and concerns that you mentioned in that opening slide, Liz, that, you know, we're forgetting those now because we're so enamored by what AI can do and what generative AI can do. You know, and, you know, Melanie, you talked about how, you know, we can see the immense potential of generative AI, right? But at the same time, there's this tension, which you also mentioned, that we're seeing countries kind of deregulating AI. And Europe itself, which was in some sense at the forefront of AI regulation, is now looking to, you know, tone down regulation in order to attract, in order to make it position itself as an attractive market. And I think here it's the same tension that comes up that I mentioned earlier. That, you know, if we focus too much on just the use cases and we take just a use case based approach, we're going to miss out on these larger structural impacts. And this is where I think we really need to be focusing our attention, that, you know, beyond kind of responsible AI principles or the accountability of specific applications, we really need to be looking at the kind of broader direction of tech innovation and how this is being led by a small group of actors, mostly white men from Silicon Valley, and that they're shaping the future of our infrastructure. They're shaping the future that our children are going to inherit without any accountability whatsoever. And it's not just things like bias or, you know, or it's not just things like privacy that I worry about. I worried about things like, you know, when we see generative AI being integrated into schools and we see research that says that, you know, it's contributing to a cognitive decline in young people, or when we see, you know, headlines about Europe heating up and we see that, you know, generative AI, how it's exacerbating the climate crisis, but we're willing to kind of put those aside using the language of trade-offs and focus instead on the positive use cases. And I'm not sure we can do that anymore. I think we have to kind of take a call at some level. And is this the trajectory that we want to be on? And if not, then what are we going to do about it? And, you know, when we think about kind of large language models, Meta, for an example, has Gen AI tools now installed into WhatsApp, right? So that's how people are now accessing information. Google has generative AI as the first entry that shows up on search. So that's how people are now accessing information. LLMs are being used for content moderation now. And so that kind of black box problem that we have with, you know, pre-LLMs is now being exacerbated. And, you know, you take it one step further and we think of, you know, this new conversation around AI agents. And one could argue that AI agents are going to be the next app. So instead of, you know, you using an Uber app, you'd use your AI agent to call an Uber. And so you'll have a lot of these AI agents connected by different APIs. And then these problems of accountability, the black box problem, all of that is just compounded. So I think we really need to kind of take stock, not just of apps and specific use cases, but really like what is the trajectory that we're going on and who is in the driving seat of that. And I think philanthropy has a huge role to play precisely because governments, especially in the global south, are so worried about losing out on this race. They're so worried about not getting a slice of the AI pie that they're they're entirely reluctant to regulate AI or to take a firm stand. So really philanthropy, I think, has a big role in keeping some of these issues on the agenda.
Thanks, Urvashi. And Pat, I guess to come back to you, is that broadly how you and Amnesty International, Amnesty Tech within Amnesty International understand the problem of tech accountability? How do you see it impacting rights and justice?
Yeah, thanks, Liz. I do agree with everything Urvashi has said. And I would also just point to the fact that what we've now come to accept as the norm, it has happened almost overnight, this corporate capture of our means of communication, of our information ecosystems. And it's fundamentally reshaped, you know, how we understand the world, how we consume information, how we relate to one another as individuals and communities, and even how we see ourselves. And I think the implications of that are profound and they can't be overstated. We rely on these companies, a handful of companies, a handful of profit-driven billionaires for so many of the essential aspects of living our lives. And these platforms and the technologies that underpin them have not been designed for the public good. They have been designed for private profit. And research and, you know, the lessons of the past, I think, decade or so have shown that whenever there's a conflict between the public good and that private profit, these corporations have chosen private profit again and again. And the consequences for human rights and justice have been so severe. I mean, we're in this moment of kind of polycrisis of rising authoritarianism, resurgent nationalism, xenophobia, racism, misogyny and transphobia, and of course, in the context of climate collapse. And I'm fully convinced that all of these issues are deeply intertwined with the dominance and power and toxic business model of big tech that is so pervasive to how we live our lives today. And you know, I think, you know, research has shown again and again that the way social media algorithms are designed, it has direct consequences for human rights, in that the most inflammatory, harmful kinds of content, including mis and disinformation, incitement to violence, hatred against minority groups, it rises to the top of the newsfeed, to the recommendations, and it drowns out truth and kind of decency. And the consequences of that spill to the offline world, and they really have huge consequences for kind of macro political outcomes and for the lives of marginalized people, and especially those in kind of at-risk, conflict-prone locations and across the global majority. And, you know, at Amnesty, we've done quite a few research investigations into exactly that, looking at, for example, how the role that Meta played in fueling the ethnic cleansing of the Rohingya in Myanmar. In 2017, we had a report out on that in 2022. The next year, we had a similar report looking at Meta's role in fueling the civil war in Ethiopia. And that's just two examples among so many where the consequences are offline, they are severe, they're linked to situations of mass violence. And this is all emanating really from a business model, you know, that is based on the voracious consumption of our intimate personal data and monetizing it for the profit of these corporations. So I think like the thing I want to highlight here is that this issue, this crises that we're currently experiencing, crises of gender justice, queer justice, racial justice, the climate crisis, they're so intertwined with big tech accountability. And I think unless and until we confront these tech companies and rein them in through effective regulation, those fights are going to be incredibly difficult to win. And I think that's something we all need to face up to if we're going to see meaningful progress across all of these issues.
Absolutely, yeah, and I think we are seeing. I mean, both Pat and Urvashi, you're both embodying the work that is being done to do that, and I'd love to hear maybe just in a couple of sentences a little bit more, and for everyone to hear a little bit more about what it is that you do about these challenges. Or Urvashi, I might come to you. Can you tell us just a little bit about you and Digital Policy Lab or Digital Futures Lab, what you do to bring about change? Sorry.
Sure, and thanks for that opportunity, Liz. So, we have been tracking the role of big tech in India and the global majority world since 2018, looking both at their kind of policies, the way platforms are being re-engineered, as well as the kind of regulation both globally and in India. And alongside that, what we've been keen to look at is the kind of material aspects of big tech powers. We do a lot of work looking at the labor implications. We do a lot of the work looking at the climate implications and thinking about, what would it take to actually have a fair data economy and a fair labor economy? And would AI still look the same? Would big tech still be able to kind of move as fast and break things if we actually compensated labor adequately, if we actually took the time and the resources required to moderate platforms adequately, etc. And our thesis is that probably not. The reason you can kind of move so fast and break things is because there's exploitation elsewhere. But I also want to kind of just use this opportunity to just flag a point, which is that I think across the global South, most organizations like myself, like mine, a lot of the funding that is available to organizations is really to address kind of downstream challenges. So it's, to address how to fix gender bias or how to ensure that the global South has a greater slice of the AI pie. But global South organizations are not being supported to ask a larger question about what is the kind of tech future that we want, right? What is the direction of innovation that we want to take? What does responsible innovation look like? And I think and there is a kind of epistemic injustice in that if the global South is just kind of fixing the problems of big tech accountability and kind of plugging the leaks in the dam, instead of being also supported to ask the big questions about the direction that we want to go in. And to that effect, something that we've started recently is doing a lot of participatory foresight activities where we bring citizens together who are kind of non-experts and really try and support them in thinking and articulating about the tech futures that they want, not about what is wrong with the current trajectory, not about how to address the big tech problem, but really what is the kind of tech future that they want. And related to that, trying to do kind of public literacy through storytelling and civic capacity strengthening of civil society organizations to be able to more meaningfully participate in this conversation around tech accountability.
Nazik, I think that's a really resonant point that it's also about who gets to do the visioning, right, and who gets to kind of write those stories of kind of positive and alternative futures. And just while we still have you, are there any kind of other organizations that you would like to sort of that you'd like to champion, who you think are doing great work, people should look up and know about?
Sure. I mean, I think in Brazil, there's Coding Rights that is doing some fantastic work that has really shone light on the kind of infrastructure issue. In South Africa, there's the Center for the Global Governance of AI that has been doing some great work looking at the labor question and also looking specifically at the challenges in Africa. In Germany, actually, which is not, obviously not a Global South organization, but there's also Super Labs, which has been doing some fantastic work around the kind of futures question, like how do we imagine alternative tech futures, and that being an important political project. So I think there are many, and I think there's a real opportunity to try and thread the needle and bring all these organizations together as well. And that's, I think, a white space that needs to be filled.
Thanks, Urvashi. And Pat, I might just come to you with the the same pair of questions, just a little bit about what Amnesty Tech is actually doing, and also, yeah, any great partners or groups or collaborations that you're part of that you'd like to shout out.
Yeah, thanks, Liz. I mean, I think firstly, just to say the problem kind of analysis that Amnesty Tech has taken since 2019 is that fundamentally the business model of big tech is broken, and we've kind of designed all of our work and our theory of change and our strategy around tackling that. So all the work we're doing ultimately goes to that end. Because all of the problems we've discussed, I think up to now, they were enabled to kind of proliferate and get to this scale because of the regulatory vacuum that has existed for so many years. And we see that as really the crucial kind of change that needs to happen, is like major regulatory reforms, introduction of laws that can rein in the harmful, toxic business practices that underlie big tech. So yeah, we took a position in 2019 with a report, Surveillance Giants, that basically stated the surveillance-based business model of the likes of Meta and Google is fundamentally incompatible with human rights. And so ever since then, we undertake kind of research investigations, participatory campaigns, advocacy, and strategic litigation, all aimed at convincing kind of people and regulators and lawmakers to introduce effective regulations that will fundamentally change that business model and ensure rights respecting alternatives. So I already mentioned the kind of investigations we do in Myanmar and in Ethiopia. All of these investigations involve collaborations with directly affected communities and partners, and without whom like none of the work we do would be possible. And we try to make that work as participatory and community centered as possible, and use that then in litigation, in advocacy, globally and kind of in strategic locations around the world. A big focus over the past few years has been the EU because of the likes of the Digital Services Act, which, you know, we were very involved in pushing for and trying to make it as progressive and as impactful as possible, up against a massive big tech lobby that were trying to water it down as much as possible. And now we still work a lot on trying to ensure effective enforcement of those tools where they do exist, while at the same time maintaining new investigations as the tech develops, as the company's kind of behavior changes. So yeah, we basically take a kind of socio-technical approach, like centering the affected communities as much as possible and complementing that with our human rights analysis, but also kind of quantitative and technical research methodologies that can measure like algorithmic amplification, other types of tech harms. And yeah, we're basically always seeking out new partnerships with communities around the world. And yeah, very briefly, just to mention some of those amazing partners that we do have, who I think deserve to be shouted out here. On the EU side of things, where we've done all that work on pushing for an effective DSA and effective implementation, we've been part of an alliance, the People versus Big Tech coalition, that's brought together tons of different organizations working across different issues, pushing for tech justice at the EU level. They've been doing really indispensable work countering the big tech lobby. We also have been partnering with local partners around the world. A couple that I would shout out are Hamle in Palestine, doing amazing work under incredibly difficult conditions, pointing out the intersections between, you know, settler colonialism and different aspects of violations faced by the Palestinian people and tech accountability. Similarly, our partner Panopticon Foundation in Poland, doing amazing work at the EU level and at the domestic level, exposing tech harms and pushing for transformative change. And then finally, I want to mention a key partner for Amnesty Tech, that's VAI, Victim Advocates International, who are actually undergoing a rebrand right now. So they may have a different name shortly, but they work with victims of atrocity crimes around the world and represent them. And we've been able to partner with them to great effect to work with victims and to push for accountability at the global level.
Fantastic, thanks, Bud, and thanks for your movement generous approach there to making sure that we're making people aware of all the fantastic work that's going on. And Patricia Melendez from the Oak Foundation, I might come to you next, because in the last couple of years, I'm sure you've just heard the names of a few of your grantees. Oak's Human Rights Program has grown its support for tech accountability work. Can you just talk us through briefly what prompted that strategic decision for Oak?
Sure, Liz, and I'm probably going to touch on some of the things that you have all sort of mentioned. You know, it's fair to say that Oak Human Rights Program has been working, you know, in restricted environments for a long time and focused, has a focus and very dispersed at the same time portfolio working from accountability for international crimes to LGBTQ rights, migrant rights to civic space and so on. So this is kind of like the spectrum of work that we have done. And through the early kind of social media coming on, we saw like, well, what are the opportunities? People can have more access to information in restricted spaces, and there's more opportunity to participate and collaborate. But at the same time, we also started seeing the decline in the direct impact on many of our grantees, not only as individuals, you know, part that are working on different organizations, but the actual work that they were doing. So for example, organizations working on civic space, noting how the decline in the quality of the discourse of conversations in many societies were impacting electoral outcomes. Or we were talking about the impact directly on specific groups, for example, the disproportionate impact on journalists or LGBTQ activists or and so on and so forth. And as well, I would say that aside from the information environment itself, we were also seeing all this other tech facilitated harms through our portfolios. For example, how tech is used in border control or surveillance and spyware. So that is kind of like the framing of how it started emerging, sort of bubbling, and this is something that we can't ignore. We knew it was important for us to kind of attach and go into the information, look at the information environment itself, but we were also unsure, like, how do we go in? What do we do? You know, given the breadth of the things that we set up, and we said like, okay, should we be thinking about media literacy? Is that the way to address information and, you know, decline? Should we be looking at content moderation and so on and so forth? So we went on our own journey, speaking to experts outside, speaking to other funders, learning a little bit what are the gaps in there and where we can make more of a difference with the, you know, finite resources that we all have. And we really decided to approach this from a systems point and looking like what is the infrastructure of these companies that allow for the amplification of this information online, and what is the business model that is.
Oh, Patricia, I think we're having a quick issue with your sound. Is something click there? All right. Well, we might, we'll come back to you in a moment, Patricia. And Melanie, I might come to.
I can hear you now. Can you hear me?
Fantastic. Yes, we can hear you. Brilliant. Sorry, Patricia, please continue.
So I hope that you heard, I mean, the last point I was saying around the monetization piece and why that was important to us. And I would say that it's safe to say this was not unique to the Human Rights Program. This is something that other OAK programs were experiencing. So our environment program was seeing the impact of disinformation on the work that they do. We had our Issues Affecting Women's program seeing that escalation of harms, you know, gender-based violence offline as a result of online violence. And our Prevent Child Sexual Abuse program was also seeing the lack of positive measures taken by tech companies for child safety online, including youth mental health. So all these things were bubbling across. So not only what the Human Rights Program was experiencing, but what we were seeing across. So that prompted two things. One is the process of the Human Rights Program developing its own strategy about tech accountability and how we want to enter the space, which I said was about kind of the amplification problem of this information, but also an exercise of coming together with other programs at Oak to see like, well, you know, we've been working at different points, you know, about the harms that are happening or the root causes of the societal problems, but we haven't been paying so much attention to really the hyper boost that technology has played on the escalation of harms and the decline of progress in some of these spaces.
Fantastic, Patricia. And I just want to encourage everyone as well, don't forget about the Slido function there on the bottom right hand corner, and do be getting your questions into us, please. And so Patricia, you know, I think you guys are a couple of years into the strategy now. How have you found that this work is kind of fitting with and supporting some of the other investments that you're making in human rights work, or if you want to pull in some of those other sections as well, or other programs?
Sure. So, I mean, I would say, as I just sort of highlighted, there's no program on Oak that is exempt from experiencing or seeing either the positive or negative sides of technology. So, across the board. So, no only human rights program. And I think we share the view that investments in the space and tech accountability space towards making technology companies more responsible for their products, transparent about their business practice, and accountable for their shortcomings is a no-brainer. Because I don't think it's necessarily just theme specific interventions. This is a system problem about how they do the business models. And I think Pat was explaining that very clearly.
Yeah.
I think our also a strategic development for us when we were doing a strategy, it coincided with developments around regulation in Europe. So, I mean, by this point, we all knew tech companies are not going to self-regulate. This is all a problem. So regulation is our only way to approach this. And we, started our kind of development around that time. So looking at the Digital Services Act, Digital Markets Act, the European AI Act, and also the UK Online Safety Act as our kind of starting spaces. How can we zero in on the problem of amplification through the enforcement of regulation and development of that? We sought also to support some initiatives around research. How do we demonstrate harms stemming from the quality of the information environment? Not necessarily, I mean, we're all very conscious about it, but how do we do it in a more empirical way that it could perhaps support legislative and litigation initiatives? And at the same time, and this to Urvashi's point about kind of noting that a lot of harms are happening in the global majority. So how do we also bring in some support in that space? I think key to us, particularly as we started and given how much we could, do in the grant making space, we really focused on some specialized funds. So for example, the European Democracy Fund, which is Civitatis, the European AI and Society Fund, and also New Moon Fund as vehicles to help us kind of learn about the ecosystem and be able to sort of support a breadth of organizations that we wouldn't be able to do on our own. So this effort sort of fit perfectly with kind of the scale of investment that we could make. And it was also an area where peers, we could lead in peers and learn from others.
Great. And you mentioned kind of joining pool funds there. Is there any kind of practical advice that you'd have for people maybe working in other foundations, people on this call, who want to include tech accountability in their investments and in their strategies? Any practical advice?
Well, I would say, the sort of first homework starts at home in a sense that you need to kind of win the audience internally, and noting that was an important thing. I also think for foundations to work across different issues like Oak, you need to kind of come together with those other programs because whilst we all see the same problem, we see it through different vantage points, but we want to make sure that we're not funding at cross purposes, but what we're doing and not duplicating efforts, but we're all working towards the same objectives. I would say speaking to other funders was highly important for us because we haven't been in this space that long. And, I'm sure there were silly questions that I have asked some of your partners like Luminate and OSF, but it doesn't matter because you're starting an area of work in your foundation, and you need to be confident that whatever investments you're going to make are the ones that are going to, be helpful to an ecosystem and not detrimental. I say also play to your strengths because each foundation has different qualities. Some foundations may be very agile and flexible and so on and so forth and dynamic. Oak perhaps is a little bit slower, but we have global reach and we can we can do long-term core support. So play for your strength. And I tell you, maybe the last thing is be comfortable with ambiguity. Like the outcomes of this area of work is not a linear outcome. It's very powerful adversaries, I would say, for civil society, and we know that this is just going to be a long game. And so that's probably where I would go. And definitely the pool funds are also a way to kind of learn a lot and also be able to reach out a lot of organizations that otherwise we wouldn't be able to make an investment on.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Patricia. And I think we're going to stay on that point of kind of practical advice. Melanie, I'm going to come back to you. And as I do, I just want to share a kind of a slide of hope, just some of the images of the really quite amazing people who are doing work. My computer has decided it doesn't want hope. Who are doing really quite amazing work in this space. And Melanie, if I can come back to you, from Luminate's point of view, you know, where do you see the opportunities in this work? Why, you know, you've decided to go all in on tech accountability work. Where do you see those opportunities?
Yeah, it's clear why we've gone in, you know, how basically we've seen how all of the ways the design and use of technology has eroded power and outcomes for people. And so the speakers definitely kind of explain all the whys, why we walked this path of like tech optimism to the front lines of tech justice, as it were. Because I mean, I think the why being like the world, we want to see a world that's more just and equitable, where people have voice and agency in how tech is designed and deployed, because we're living in an increasingly digital world. And I think despite not being as tech optimistic, that's still a pretty optimistic view. In terms of the opportunities, I think there are pretty much three in my mind for funders and foundations. Like, you know, we look at very simple ones. One, growing the field of people who are thinking of different ways to find their ways through this challenge. Two, new ways of unpicking the problem, as Patricia was talking about the ambiguity. The pathways to change are something that we still have to work through in this complex system, but it's still worth the effort. And the third one is really about finding new partnerships and ways of working together, because this is kind of such a systems-wide kind of problem. The things that I'm thinking about in terms of opportunities are how we can connect different movements, say those in climate justice or health equity, education, culture, labor rights, racial equity. You know, there's so many areas that our speakers have talked about, touching at the intersections of these social change movements and their work. I think there is a kind of a pivotal moment right now where it's still possible to lean in together. But because we were talking about corporate capture and outsized power of these tech companies, we're looking for this kind of investment, that risk capital that has to be grounded in both experiences in different places. With Ashi's work and so is Amnesty's in kind of the global majority, a part of the answer in innovation, not just seeing where harms you know, are affecting people, but also innovation for change, but also cross sector partnerships where we can shift power in different ways together. So I do see these kind of coalitions that are coming together from not the usual suspects as well, to challenge the tech status quo. And I think with that kind of less, you know, just like the tech companies framing of more exponential kind of approaches to this, you know, we do need kind of quite a lot of ambition and more partners and more impact to kind of break beyond this tech bubble.
Fantastic, Melanie. And I guess for people on this call who are maybe working in foundations, they want to find out more, they want to kind of get more involved, what practical advice can you give people? What can they do next?
I think of the people in this call, and you know, there's a few of us that identify as tech justice funders, and many more that are working in these other spaces that we talked about in health and education, democracy. I don't think the answer is that everybody has to fund tech justice necessarily, but the way we can think about it is asking what are the digital systems that are reinforcing or undermining your goals? I mean, speak to your grantee partners about tech and what they're experiencing about these pressures, whether it's disinformation or online hate, privacy breaches, surveillance. There are many. And I think they're most certainly trying to find a way, just as the AI tide arrives, as our speakers have talked about. And I think there are lots of ways that we can partner with them to kind of learn and learn about the space, and also partner with other organizations that see themselves more working on this tech justice issue. There is a growing field that has depth and expertise. So it's not like we all have to start from scratch, but it is kind of sharing and learning together that is an important point, because of how pervasive and how spread out this topic is, touching so many different areas, and knowing that with such a big problem, kind of leaning in together, taking risks together is probably what's required, because this is probably longer term work, not a crisis response right now. And those are some of the things that, you know, thinking globally and being outside kind of the line of sight of Silicon Valley is where we need to apply our brains to really deep listening, to really respond to what's going on. At the front lines of where the harms and risks and opportunities are.
Thanks, Melanie. And I've dropped the partnerships at luminategroup.com email address in the chat there if anybody wants to sort of follow up and open up and continue some of these conversations. And I know that you're definitely one of those funders that other people go to when they need to pick brains on this question. So thank you for that. I do want to just open up. We've had a couple of questions coming in on the chat. So what I might do is I might just sort of read out some of them, and then we might do just a kind of a final round of responses and insights from the panel. If that is okay, I'll put these to you. And if none of them kind of call to you, I guess what's the one thing you'd like people on this call to do next is my question. But on top of that, we have a question here, or Urvashi, you mentioned storytelling is great. Is really good in this sort of in this area. Can you think of any good case studies where storytelling has been used to make something that's quite complex accessible? So that's one of the questions. Another question is what to do about when it's not unintended harms of AI or technology, but we think of tech that's specifically designed to do harm, like AI generating tools that are created to make abusive content or autonomous weapons, things like that. And then a question, Pat, about the litigation efforts up against tech companies. You know, have any of those sort of resulted in fines or prosecutions or kind of impacts across the piece? So there's a couple of different questions there. Pat, I might come to you first because that was quite a specific question. And then Urvashi, I'll come to you, Patricia, and then Melanie to finish us out. So we probably have about 1 minute each, Pat, to close us out.
Sure, thanks, Liz, and thank you for that question. Unfortunately, I can't report a whole host of resounding victories against big tech in the courts to date, but I think to me that just speaks to the kind of David and Goliath nature of the fight. The way we see strategic litigation is not just for one victory in one court, but part of the broader kind of advocacy approach that we have to raise attention to the issues and to draw attention to the accountability gaps that do exist. I will point to one case that we've had some good news in, and that is in Kenya, where we're participating in litigation against Meta for its role in the Ethiopian civil war that I mentioned earlier. Amnesty had a report on that, and quite recently, just a couple of months ago, the Kenyan High Court ruled that case could be heard in Kenya, and that's really significant because it's been so hard to hold these companies to account because they will say you have to sue us in the US where we're headquartered, and then there's regulatory kind of barriers in place to actually suing them in that jurisdiction. Mm-hmm. So to see the Kenyan courts actually being willing to hear this case on its merits is a huge step forward for tech accountability, and that's one to keep your eye on, and one that many were engaged in along with many partners and victims of Facebook's role there. And another thing I would say is it takes a lot of creativity to try and hold these companies accountable because of the barriers to justice. So another area we're working on now increasingly is looking at competition and antitrust as a way to hold these companies accountable, to challenge the dominance and power and monopolies that exist in the space. But be very happy to chat more about any of that separately. I'll stop there.
Fantastic, thank you. And you can be found on LinkedIn and all the normal spaces, Pat, I'm sure. Urvashi, if I can come to you, there was a specific question there for you around any good examples of kind of storytelling.
Yeah, I think, some of the best examples of storytelling might actually even come from big tech themselves. A lot of the ways in which big tech have been able to sell this narrative about, the promise of AI or whatever has actually been through storytelling. And so I think we can take a leaf out of their book also and use it to strategize what we might want to do in civil society. On the civil society end, I think, there's been a recent project by the Distributed AI Research Institute that is led by Timnit, whose picture you had up on the slide earlier, where they've done a kind of first-person storytelling from data workers living in Syria and other parts of the Middle East about what their experience has been as data workers. And I think it's a really powerful way to kind of reflect on that invisible labor of AI. And, just a little bit of self-promotion here as well. We've put out a series of kind of comics recently, a series of graphic novels, which looks at the use of AI in various sectors in the Indian context and tries to talk about the harms in the near future through a storytelling approach. There was also the question about unintended harms and what do we do? And just to say there that, we do need strong regulation, and we really need to kind of push back against this narrative of this false binary between regulation and innovation, that if we regulate too much, we'll stifle innovation. In fact, good regulation will drive good innovation, and that is the function of regulation. So I think we really need to ensure that we are going strong on regulation and not swept up by the hype around AI.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you, Urvashi. Patricia, I might come to you to you next. So yeah, just any of those questions that have come in.
I was thinking about, your initial comment about what two things I would want others to take away, particularly in the philanthropy space. I would say really reach out across sectors. I think talking to environmental funders, talking to funders in other spaces, to those in the education space, to us, the fund and labor, I think it's important. And I would say Luminate is a good partner, and we've been working and talking about how best to do this and bring it together. And I would also want to highlight what Melanie said around taking risks. Right now, it feels very scary to take risks given the geopolitical context. But, small investments can have really far-reaching and positive outcomes. And then we also know that long-term investments can sometimes take a little longer to mature. And obviously, the funding space for human rights and generally philanthropy, it's also a difficult one right now, given the changes to funding across the world. And, we will try to do the best that we can, but the realities are also there that we're probably not able to cover it all, but we try to do it responsibly and in coordination with others.
And there was a specific question for you there around pooled funds, and you mentioned that you had some experience of them. I think the question was around whether the funds kind of get diluted too much, or if they arrive where they need to go. What's your sense of that?
I think, at least for us, they have been really important partners and able to kind of giving us the ability to reach a lot more organizations than we would otherwise be able to do, just because the practicalities of how Oak does funding, and I presume it will be the same for others. I also think it really gives you exposure to a range of organizations that you would otherwise not come across, and then you could bilaterally kind of support as it fits with your program. So it has various kind of helpful functions, but I appreciate obviously that concern that, is it going to the operational cost of running a fund as opposed to regranting to those that most need it in the field. And there's also, most foundations will have considerations around that, and those pool funds will have also kind of policies around how much they ought to be regranting from what they're receiving. I hope that that was helpful.
Very helpful, Patricia. Thank you. And Melanie, so I'm going to come to you for the last word. And just while you're speaking, I'm just going to pop that email address and just a way to get in touch with Luminate in the corner there, partnerships@luminategroup.com, just in case anybody doesn't have access to the chat. My computer is jumping all over the place, so I might jump out of there. Melanie, the last word to you.
I kind of was thinking of the story that, the question that Neil in the questions asked about litigation efforts, because I think wins are also really powerful to spur people to think about this. And we've given quite a lot of how the tech giants are giants, etc. And I think recently something we supported was very inspiring. It was Tanya O'Carroll's legal action against Meta in the UK. That was a test case. Pat's nodding. He knows it very well from People versus Big Tech. But it's a very simple and human story of somebody who grew up with Facebook, sharing, connecting as part of daily life, and then she had a baby and everything changed because the ads, the algorithm, the targeting just felt so relentless and invasive to her. And so she thought, surely I can turn this off because that's creepy. But of course she couldn't. And there was no real choice. And that is kind of the thing we're faced. Like all of us are like, okay, we'll just accept it because there's no choice. But that moment of being tracked and profiled during one of these life's most intimate points for her really sparked the case that she said. And she wanted to say no, but then Meta was the one that said, no, that's not allowed. And things that, talking about risk taking, as Patricia did, kind of seeing this very early potential could be important, and seeing this case before really was the thinking of being able to kind of look for the potential of a case like this to emerge. And it's kind of early patient capital that philanthropy can do, that risk capital that we were talking about, that helped the work begin, from things like seed funding, specialist law firm that took on the case, support to people versus big tech, which is that campaign network that helped frame and build the public pressure for the issue. A comms hub called the Better Information Project to shape narratives, as we were talking about, kind of thinking about all of these ecosystem actors that need to be together, working in collaboration to kind of push this across. And the case was thus made by coordinated support of the whole infrastructure that supported Tanya in her willingness to come forward as a litigant. So I think that was a win when eventually now the UK regulators said, yes, you can ask Facebook to turn off targeted ads. And that's something that inspires me as a reason why, you know, Luminate is really leaning in to be an ecosystem funder, of being there early, being able to learn from the field what works and what doesn't work, and being able to connect the dots in real time. And so that's what I'm very excited about, and see the potential for more of us to get around the table to work on together.
And that's a fantastic positive note for us to end on. So thank you again, and thank you to all of our panelists. Thank you to Melanie Hui from Luminate, CEO of Luminate, Patrick Brunn, Head of Big Tech Accountability at Amnesty International, Urvashi Aneja, from the founder and executive director of Digital Futures Lab, and Patricia Melendez, Program Officer at the Oak Foundation. Thank you, everybody. Thank you to Luminate and to Alliance for convening us all here this afternoon. And thank you to everybody for listening in. Do follow up and find us and reach out. And we're all always very happy to talk about these topics. So do please keep in touch. Thank you very much.